What if everything you thought you knew about your family was built on lies? When millionaire Paul Hargrave comes home unexpectedly early to find his dining table set for two, despite living alone for years, his perfect world begins to crumble. The mysterious young woman in his daughter's bedroom isn't who she claims to be. And his estranged daughter? She's been keeping secrets that will shatter the foundations of his carefully constructed life. As buried truths emerge from the shadows, Paul must face the devastating reality that the people closest to him, his late wife, his only daughter, were strangers he never truly saw. Now, a cassette tape with his daughter's final message forces him to confront the ultimate question. Can you find redemption when it's already too late? This heart-wrenching story of family secrets, shattered identities, and second chances will leave you questioning how well you really know the people you love. If this story touched your heart, please follow our channel for more powerful stories that explore the depths of human connection. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from, and share with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to truly see the people right in front of us. The fine rain tapped against the windows of Paul Hargrave's silent mansion, a rhythmic counterpoint to the hollow echo of his footsteps across the marble foyer. At 58, Paul had amassed the kind of fortune that made people whisper his name in boardrooms across Manhattan. But it was his coldness, not his wealth, that had become his trademark. His employees had a saying, "Hargrave doesn't cast a shadow, he is the shadow." Tonight, that shadow had returned unexpectedly. The thunderstorm over Chicago had grounded all flights, forcing him to take an earlier connection. 6 hours earlier than planned, he now stood in his darkened entrance hall, water dripping from his tailored Italian suit onto the imported Persian rug. Something felt immediately wrong. Paul dropped his leather briefcase with a hollow thud that echoed through the empty house. He never announced when he was coming home. He enjoyed catching the staff unprepared, a small power play he'd cultivated over decades. But tonight, the wrongness wasn't in what he saw. It was what he smelled. White roses. Their scent hung in the air like a ghost. His heart stuttered. Vanessa had always insisted on white roses. "They're honest," she used to say. "No dye, no pretending to be something they're not." But Vanessa had been dead for 2 years now. Cancer, quick and merciless, leaving him alone with their only daughter, Lily. And then, even Lily had gone, cutting all ties after that final, terrible argument. Paul followed the scent, his leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet as he moved through the shadows. The smell grew stronger as he approached the formal dining room, a room he hadn't used since Vanessa's last birthday celebration. He pushed the heavy oak door open, his breath caught in his throat. The massive mahogany dining table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. It was set for two. Crystal glasses caught the light and fragmented it across the white tablecloth. Fine china plates, the Wedgwood set Vanessa had cherished, sat perfectly aligned with polished silver cutlery. 2 tall candles flickered in the center, their flames dancing as the breeze from the slightly open window caressed them. A feast was laid out. Roast duck with orange glaze, asparagus tied in neat bundles, potatoes dauphinoise steaming in their dish. Vanessa's favorites. All of them. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. He lived alone. The housekeeper came 3 times a week, but never on Fridays. The chef had been dismissed last month for daring to suggest a new menu. There was no one who could have done this. No one except Lily? His daughter's name came out as a croak. The silence answered him. He approached the table slowly, noticing details that made his skin crawl. The napkins were folded in the exact swan shape that Vanessa had insisted upon for special occasions. The silverware was arranged in the precise, unconventional pattern his wife had preferred. Fork on the right, knife on the left. No one else knew this arrangement. No one. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek. But Paul didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the left plate, where a small folded card sat against the pristine white china. With trembling fingers, he picked it up. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, like someone trying very hard to control their emotions while writing. "Dad, I tried again. Listen to me this time." The card fell from his fingers. He stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair. Fear, an emotion so unfamiliar it felt like a physical illness, crawled up his spine. Paul hadn't felt fear since he was 12 and his father had caught him stealing from the church collection plate. But now, in his own home, surrounded by wealth and power, he felt naked with it. That's when he heard it. Voices from upstairs, from Lily's old room. Paul moved to the grand staircase, his hand gripping the polished banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. Each step felt like climbing a mountain. The voices grew clearer, or rather, a single voice, repeating the same phrases over and over. "Hello, Dad. I'm Lily." "No, no." Again. "Dad, do you know me? I'm your daughter." The voice sounded young, hesitant, but there was something wrong with it, something broken in the cadence. The door to Lily's bedroom was ajar, soft light spilling onto the hallway carpet. Paul pushed it open further. A young woman stood before the ornate Victorian mirror, her back to him. She wore a threadbare gray hoodie and faded jeans. Her feet were bare, her dark hair tangled and unwashed. She was practicing what seemed like a speech, her thin shoulders hunched forward in a posture of defeat. "Dad, it's me. I know it's been—" "No." She shook her head violently. "Dad, please just listen for once. I'm trying to—" She caught his reflection in the mirror and froze. Slowly, she turned around. Paul felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. It was like seeing Lily at 17 again. The same heart-shaped face, the same constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose. But the eyes were wrong. Where Lily's had been defiant and bright, these were hollow, haunted. They belonged to someone who had seen too much darkness. "Who are you?" Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. "And what are you doing in my house?" The girl's eyes widened with something between terror and recognition. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like someone drowning on dry land. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice finding its familiar edge. "Who the hell are you? And why are you pretending to be my daughter?" "I asked who you are." Paul's voice thundered through the room, bouncing off the pale pink walls that hadn't changed since Lily was 16. The sudden shift from his whisper to a roar made the girl flinch as if she'd been struck. She took a step backward, her bare heel hitting Lily's antique dresser. The silver-framed family photos atop it trembled from the impact. Snapshots of happier times. Lily at her high school graduation, her mother's arm around her shoulders. Lily riding her first horse on their weekend estate in Connecticut. Lily blowing out candles on her 13th birthday. Paul standing awkwardly in the background, checking his watch. The girl swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly beneath the stretched collar of her worn hoodie. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "My name is Ruth," she said, holding his gaze with unexpected courage. "Ruth Calloway." Paul stepped further into the room, his presence seeming to suck the air from the space. The rain outside had intensified, now drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. "I don't care what your name is," he snarled, his face contorted with rage and confusion. "I want to know why you're in my daughter's room, wearing her clothes, sitting at a table set exactly like—" His voice broke, and he steadied himself against the doorframe. Ruth's fingers twisted anxiously in the hem of her hoodie. Lily's hoodie, he now realized. The faded Northwestern University logo was unmistakable. He'd argued with Lily when she chose Northwestern over Harvard, another battle in their endless war. "Lily invited me," Ruth said finally. We met at the shelter downtown. 3 months ago." Paul's laugh was brittle, like glass breaking. "Impossible. My daughter hasn't set foot in this house for 2 years. My daughter doesn't exist for me anymore." The words escaped before he could catch them. The cruel declaration he'd made to his executive assistant when she'd tried to remind him of Lily's birthday last year. The girl's eyes widened, then narrowed with something that looked almost like pity. "She said you might say that," Ruth whispered. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn as if it had been opened and refolded countless times. "She gave me this, in case something happened to her." Paul snatched the paper from her hand. It was torn from a leather-bound journal, the same journal he'd given Lily for her 16th birthday. The handwriting was unmistakably his daughter's, looping, artistic, with the distinctive way she crossed her T's with a slight upward curve. "If something happens to me, please give this to my father. He needs to know I tried. One last time." The date scrawled in the corner was just 2 months ago. "This proves nothing," Paul said, but his voice had lost its conviction. He pulled his phone from his pocket, fingers hovering over the screen. "I'm calling the police. Breaking and entering. Identity theft. Fraud. Take your pick." Ruth didn't move, didn't try to run. Instead, she looked at him with those hollow eyes that seemed to hold secrets far too heavy for someone so young. "She's gone, Mr. Hargrave," she said quietly. 3 weeks ago. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. "What are you talking about?" Paul's finger paused over the emergency call button. "Lily died 3 weeks ago." Ruth's voice was eerily calm now, as if she had moved beyond grief into some numb twilight state. "But not before she told me everything. She wanted you to know who she really was, not who you thought she was." The phone slipped from Paul's fingers, clattering on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to come from miles away. A strange buzzing filled his ears, and the edges of his vision darkened momentarily. "You're lying," he managed, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. Ruth shook her head slowly. "The dinner downstairs, and it was her idea. She planned it before." She swallowed hard. "She made me promise to do it exactly as she described, to set the table the way her mother taught her, to cook the foods you all used to share on special occasions. She said it might be the only way to make you listen." Paul's legs suddenly couldn't support his weight. He sank onto the window seat, his mind reeling. The rain outside painted watery shadows across his ashen face. "If my daughter is dead," he said, each word like a stone being pulled from his throat. "Why wasn't I notified? I'm her only living relative." Ruth's eyes dropped to the floor. "She removed you as her emergency contact after your last fight. She put me instead. That's absurd. You're a stranger. A homeless girl she supposedly met in a shelter." His voice was rising again, desperate to find the flaw in her story, the lie that would unravel everything. "Not a stranger to her," Ruth said softly. "We shared everything for those months. She was the sister I never had." As she spoke, something fell from her pocket. A small photograph. Paul lunged forward and grabbed it before she could react. In the image, 2 young women stood arm in arm before a graffiti-covered wall. One was clearly Lily, thinner than he remembered, her smile tight but genuine. Beside her stood Ruth, looking healthier than she did now, her arm protectively around Lily's shoulders. The date stamp in the corner confirmed it was taken just 6 weeks ago. "This doesn't make sense," Paul whispered, more to himself than to Ruth. "If she's been..." He couldn't bring himself to say the word dead. "If what you say is true, why are you here now? Why go through with this charade?" "Because she made me promise," Ruth replied, tears now streaming down her face. "She said you deserved one last chance to know her, the real her, not the daughter you wanted, but the daughter you had." Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in harsh white light. In that flash, Paul saw something that made his blood run cold. Ruth's eyes, caught in the stark illumination, looked exactly like Vanessa's, the same unusual shade of amber green, the same shape. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question held a different weight. Before Ruth could answer, a phone rang. His landline, downstairs in his study. No one ever called that number except his most important clients. "Don't move," he commanded, backing toward the door. "Not 1 inch." As he turned to leave, Ruth called after him. "Mr. Hargrave, there's something else you should know. Something Lily wanted me to tell you right away." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Her last journal is buried under the white rose bush, the one where you scattered her mother's ashes." Ruth's voice quavered. "She said you'd understand what that means." Paul felt the room spin around him. No one knew about the roses. No one but Lily. The ringing phone went unanswered as Paul stumbled through the darkened hallway toward the garden. The grand colonial mansion, usually so orderly and controlled, now seemed to shift around him like a living thing. Portraits of stern-faced Hargrave ancestors watched from the walls as he passed, their painted eyes following his desperate progress. Outside, the storm had intensified. The manicured lawn glistened under the assault of rain, and the wind bent the elegant weeping willows almost to the ground. Paul didn't bother with an umbrella or coat. He plunged into the downpour, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the sodden earth as he made his way to the rose garden. The white roses stood like pale ghosts in the darkness, their usually pristine petals now battered by the rain. In the center stood the prize bush, the Alba Maxima that Vanessa had nurtured for years. After her cremation, he'd scattered her ashes at its roots, a private ceremony with just him and Lily present. He hadn't cried that day. Lily had wept enough for both of them, while he'd stood rigid, his grief locked away behind the wall he'd built around his heart decades ago. Now Paul fell to his knees in the mud, his hands clawing at the soil beneath the bush. His fingers soon struck something solid, a metal box, about the size of a thick hardcover book. His hands trembled so violently he could barely work the simple latch. When it finally opened, he found a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic to protect it from the elements. Lily's name was embossed in gold on the cover. He clutched it to his chest and ran back to the house, leaving muddy footprints across the imported marble floors. In the study, Paul placed the journal on his desk with reverence, as if it might disintegrate at a careless touch. The room, his sanctuary, suddenly felt foreign. The wall of finance books, the collection of rare scotch, the mounted certificates of achievement, all seemed like artifacts from a stranger's life. He became aware of Ruth's presence in the doorway. She had followed him silently, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. She stood watching him, her thin frame draped in shadows. "You should read it," she said softly. She wanted you to. Paul opened the journal with shaking hands. The first page held just a single sentence. "To my father, who never saw me when I was standing right in front of him." The words struck like a physical blow. He turned the page. "Dad, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because I want to be, but because I've run out of ways to make you see me. I've spent my whole life trying to catch your eye. With perfect grades, with rebellious acts, with silence, with screams. Nothing worked. You looked right through me, always seeing the daughter you wanted instead of the one you had. Remember how Mom used to say your real home was the stock exchange? She was wrong. Your real home is the fortress you've built around yourself. No one gets in. Not even you get out. I'm writing this from New Horizons Psychiatric Center. I checked myself in 3 months ago after my third suicide attempt. You never knew about the first two. I made sure of that. The dean at Northwestern called you about the third. You told her to handle it discreetly and wire you the hospital bill. That's when I knew I had to let you go if I wanted to live. At New Horizons, I met Ruth. She saved me, Dad. Not the doctors or the medications or the therapy, though they all helped. But Ruth was the first person who ever really saw me. All of me. The broken pieces and the whole ones. She escaped her own father at 13. He hurt her in ways no child should ever be hurt. For years, she lived on the streets, in shelters, in strangers' homes. But she survived. She's the strongest person I've ever known. We made a pact. If one of us didn't make it, the other would carry our story forward. I'm tired, Dad. So tired of trying to make you love me. If you're reading this, it means I've lost my battle. But I wanted to give you one last chance to know who I really was. Not the perfect daughter you wanted, but the messy, real person I became. I forgive you, Dad. I hope someday you can forgive yourself. Love always, Lily. The letter was dated just 6 weeks ago. The ink had smeared in places, as if drops of water, or tears, had fallen on the page as she wrote. Paul ran his fingers over the smudges, feeling a terrible intimacy in touching the places where his daughter's tears had fallen. He looked up at Ruth, who still stood in the doorway, her face half in shadow. Is this true? His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, rough, vulnerable, stripped of its usual authority. The suicide attempts? The psychiatric center? Ruth nodded slowly. She overdosed the first time during freshman year. The second time was after your fight at Christmas when you told her she was just like her mother, weak and emotional. The third time, she paused, swallowing hard. The third time was after she found out about me. What do you mean, found out about you? Paul's grief momentarily gave way to confusion. Instead of answering, Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small blue pendant on a silver chain. She held it out to him, the stone catching the lamplight. She said this was her mother's, that you would recognize it. Paul felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that pendant, a rare blue labradorite set in sterling silver. He'd given it to Vanessa on their first anniversary, long before the wealth and the success, when they were still young and deeply in love. She had worn it every day until her illness made even the light weight of it too much to bear. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Lily gave it to me," Ruth replied simply. "She said I should keep it safe until I could give it to you." Paul took the pendant, its familiar weight in his palm unleashing a flood of memories. Vanessa laughing as he clasped it around her neck. Vanessa absently touching it during difficult conversations as if drawing strength from it. Vanessa pressing it into Lily's small hand the night before she died, whispering words he couldn't hear. "There's more," Ruth said. her voice barely audible over the storm outside. She left letters, one for each week after she was gone. I was supposed to bring them to you, one by one. Why didn't you? Paul asked, looking up from the pendant. Ruth's hollow eyes met his. I tried. I came to your office 3 times. Your security staff turned me away. I left messages with your assistant. She said you were too busy. The shame that washed over Paul was so intense it felt like physical pain. How many times had he instructed his staff to shield him from unnecessary distractions? How many people had tried to reach him with important news, only to be deflected by the barriers he'd erected? I met Lily at New Horizons, Ruth continued, moving into the study and perching on the edge of a leather chair. I was there because my last foster placement didn't work out. The carefully neutral way she said it spoke volumes. When I first saw Lily, I thought she was a volunteer. She looked so put together. Designer clothes, perfect hair. But then I saw her wrists. Paul flinched, his imagination filling in the terrible blank. We became roommates, then friends. Then, Ruth paused, searching for the right word. Sisters, I guess. We both knew what it was like to be invisible to the people who should have loved us most. She looked directly at Paul then, a flash of anger breaking through her carefully controlled facade. I was abused by my father from the time I was 6 until I ran away at 13. Lily was neglected by hers for 18 years. Different kinds of damage, same result. The accusation hung in the air between them, undeniable in its truth. When did she? Paul couldn't bring himself to say the word. 3 weeks ago, Ruth said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She left the hospital against medical advice, said she needed to put things in order. I didn't know what she meant until afterward when I found her letters in the journal. She had it all planned out. Thunder crashed outside, the lights flickering momentarily. In that brief darkness, Paul thought he saw the outline of someone else in the room, a slender figure standing just behind Ruth. When the lights stabilized, there was no one there. Why would she want me to know now? He asked, clutching the journal to his chest like a shield. If she believed I didn't care when she was alive, why would she think I'd care after she was gone? Ruth smiled sadly. Because despite everything, she never stopped hoping you'd see her one day. Really see her. She called it her stupid, stubborn heart. It wouldn't let her give up on you, even when her mind knew better. She stood, smoothing down her borrowed clothes, with a gesture that reminded Paul painfully of Vanessa. There's more in the journal, and I have the rest of her letters. But maybe that's enough for tonight. As she moved toward the door, Paul called after her. You still haven't told me who you really are. Ruth paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. I told you, I'm the girl who shared a room with your daughter in a psychiatric hospital. I'm the person who held her hand when the nightmares came. I'm the one she trusted with her story. She hesitated, then added softly, and I think I might be the daughter she wished she could be for you. Sleep eluded Paul that night. The vast master bedroom with its custom king-sized bed and imported Egyptian cotton sheets felt like a mausoleum. He paced the floor until dawn painted the sky in shades of wounded pink, his mind replaying fragments of Lily's letter until each word was branded into his consciousness. When the first tentative rays of morning light slipped through the curtains, he made his way downstairs. The dinner from the previous night still sat on the dining room table, now congealed and cold, a feast for ghosts. He found Ruth asleep on the living room sofa, curled into herself like a child. She'd draped herself with the throw blanket Vanessa had crocheted during her chemotherapy, one of the few personal items he hadn't been able to bring himself to pack away. Seeing it wrapped around this stranger stirred something complex in his chest, resentment tangled with an odd sense of rightness. In the pale morning light, with her defenses lowered by sleep, Ruth looked younger and more vulnerable. Her face bore the softened imprint of Lily's features, not a genetic resemblance, but something acquired, as if proximity had blurred the boundaries between them. Paul retreated to the kitchen where he mechanically prepared coffee, a task he hadn't performed for himself in years. His housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, would arrive at 9, and with her would come the ordered routine of his weekends: pressed newspaper, perfectly poached eggs, freshly squeezed orange juice served in crystal. Today, he couldn't bear the thought of such normalcy. He was on his second cup of bitter coffee when Ruth appeared in the doorway, her borrowed clothes rumpled from sleep, her eyes wary. I thought you might have called the police, she said, her voice rough with sleep. Paul gestured to the coffee pot. Help yourself. She moved cautiously into the kitchen, keeping the granite island between them as she poured herself a cup. The mug she chose was Lily's favorite, a chipped Northwestern souvenir that Mrs. Winters had tried to dispose of multiple times, only to have Paul inexplicably insist on keeping it. I have something else of hers, Ruth said after taking a careful sip. Something she wanted you to have. From the pocket of her hoodie, she produced a small cassette tape. The label, written in Lily's distinctive handwriting, read simply, "For Dad." Paul stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "What's on it?" "I don't know," Ruth admitted. "She made it the night before she left. Said it was for your ears only." The cassette sat between them on the island, a relic from another time. Paul couldn't remember the last time he'd owned something that played cassette tapes. His home office contained state-of-the-art technology, updated quarterly by his IT team. "There's an old player in her room," Ruth offered, sensing his dilemma. "In the closet behind her winter coats. She showed it to me in a photo once." Paul's eyebrows rose. "You've never been here before?" Ruth shook her head. "Just in pictures. Lily showed me her whole childhood through her phone. Every room, every corner. She talked about this house like it was a character in her story." The realization that his daughter had documented their home, preserving it in digital amber while she herself remained absent, sent a pang through Paul's chest. How many other parts of her life had he missed, dismissed, or simply failed to notice? He left his coffee untouched and made his way back to Lily's room, the cassette clutched in his hand like a talisman. Ruth followed at a distance, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. The bedroom looked different in daylight, less a shrine and more what it truly was. The abandoned chamber of a young woman caught between childhood and adulthood. Posters of bands Paul didn't recognize shared wall space with framed academic certificates. A collection of small glass animals crowded her dresser, a hobby Vanessa had encouraged, that Paul had barely acknowledged. He found the cassette player exactly where Ruth had said it would be, covered in a fine layer of dust. It was an old model, the kind with a built-in speaker. He placed the tape inside and after a moment's hesitation pressed play. Static crackled, followed by silence. Then, softly at first, came Lily's voice singing, "You Are My Sunshine," the lullaby Vanessa had sung to her every night until she was 12, and declared herself too old for bedtime songs. Her voice was tremulous but beautiful, with the same rich timbre that had made her mother's singing so captivating. As the last notes faded, Lily's voice continued, now speaking. "Dad, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I don't know if you'll care if you do, but I need to say these things, even if it's just to the air." A pause, the sound of a shaky breath. "I know you think I hate you, that I blame you for everything wrong in my life. Maybe parts of me do, but most of me just misses you. The you that used to exist before Mom got sick, before your work became your whole world. Do you remember teaching me to ride a bike in Central Park? You ran alongside me for almost 2 miles because I was too scared to pedal alone. Your expensive suit got all sweaty, and you didn't care. You laughed about it." Paul sank onto Lily's bed, the memory washing over him with such force he felt dizzy. He'd forgotten that day entirely, but now he could feel the humid summer air, hear Lily's peals of laughter, as she finally found her balance. "You tried, Dad. I know you did. But somewhere along the way you stopped trying. You built this perfect life that had no room for imperfection. And I am so imperfect." Her voice broke slightly. "The doctors here say I have borderline personality disorder. Did you know that?" "Probably not. The symptoms started after Mom died, but nobody noticed because grief looks a lot like mental illness sometimes. By the time I got to college, I was falling apart, cutting, drinking, sleeping with anyone who made me feel something, anything." Paul flinched, his hand instinctively moving to stop the tape, to silence these intimacies he wasn't sure he could bear, but he forced himself to listen. "I didn't want you to know. Your perfect daughter, the one who got into Northwestern, the one who was going to follow in your financial footsteps. She couldn't be crazy, right? So I hid it. I became so good at pretending to be okay that sometimes I fooled even myself." The tape went silent for several seconds, just the sound of Lily's breathing. "I met Ruth here. She's like me, but different. Broken in complementary ways. We fit together like puzzle pieces. She's going to bring this to you if things don't work out for me. Please be kind to her, Dad. Be kinder to her than you were to me." Another pause, longer this time. "I keep thinking about the last time I saw you. You said I was just like Mom, too emotional, too sensitive for my own good. You meant it as an insult, but it's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, because Mom was brave and kind and saw beauty in everything. If I'm anything like her, then maybe I did something right after all." The tape clicked off abruptly, leaving the room in silence so profound Paul could hear his own heartbeat. He looked up to find Ruth watching him from the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Wordlessly, she crossed the room and opened Lily's closet, reaching to the back of the highest shelf. She withdrew a shoebox, dusty and dented. "She told me about this too," Ruth said softly, placing the box on the bed beside him. "Said if you ever listened to the tape, I should show you these." Inside the box were dozens of cassettes, each labeled with dates spanning back years. Thoughts for Dad, September 2020. Things I wish I could tell Dad, November 2021. Dad's birthday letter unsent, March 2022. She made these for years, Ruth explained, her voice gentle. It was her therapist's idea, to say the things she couldn't say to you in person. She never thought you'd hear them. Paul lifted one of the tapes with trembling fingers. The weight of all these unheard words, these one-sided conversations, pressed on his chest until he could barely breathe. "There's something else," Ruth said, reaching into the box and pulling out a faded manila envelope. The words, "For the father that I might have one day," were written across the front. Inside was a single photograph. 3 people stood in front of a weathered stone cottage. Lily looking about 16, Ruth, much younger and almost unrecognizable with longer hair and a fuller face. And between them, with an arm around each girl, stood Vanessa's mother, Catherine. "I don't understand," Paul whispered, staring at the impossible grouping. "My mother-in-law died last year. Lily was estranged from me by then. And you said you only met Lily a few months ago." Ruth took the photo, studying it with a sad smile. "That's not me," she said softly. "That's my sister Rachel. She died 4 years ago, drug overdose." As Paul's confusion deepened, his cell phone rang from downstairs. The distinctive tone he'd assigned to his executive assistant. A tone that meant urgent business that had pulled him away from countless family dinners, school performances, and quiet evenings at home. For the first time in his career, Paul Hargrave let the call go to voicemail. The cemetery gates loomed before them, wrought iron curlicues reaching toward a sky the color of brushed steel. Riverside Memorial Gardens was the final resting place of New York's elite. Old money families and new tech billionaires alike purchased plots here, securing prestigious Manhattan real estate, even in death. Paul gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley, knuckles white against the hand-stitched leather. Beside him, Ruth sat silently, her borrowed clothes, a simple black dress of Lily's that hung loose on her smaller frame, making her look like a child playing dress-up. "You're sure this is where?" Paul couldn't finish the sentence. 3 days had passed since Ruth's arrival, and he still couldn't bring himself to say the words aloud, as if naming the reality might cement it beyond any hope of error or reprieve. "Yes," Ruth said softly, her eyes fixed on the cemetery's stone archway. Lily arranged everything herself. She left detailed instructions with her lawyer. "Her lawyer?" Paul's voice cracked with disbelief. "My 19-year-old daughter had a lawyer I didn't know about?" Ruth turned to look at him, those haunting amber-green eyes unsettlingly direct. "Your 19-year-old daughter had a trust fund, the one your wife set up before she died. It became accessible when Lily turned 18. Another piece of information Paul had overlooked. Vanessa had indeed established a modest trust for Lily. Pocket change compared to his own fortune, but enough for a young woman to secure independent legal counsel, to make arrangements without his knowledge or consent. They passed through the gates in silence, following the winding path through immaculate grounds. September had turned the maples to flame, their red and gold leaves drifting down to rest on gleaming headstones and polished marble mausoleums. Ruth directed him to the newer section of the cemetery, where the landscaping was still establishing itself. Young trees staked against the wind, freshly laid sod, still visible in seams. They parked, and Paul followed Ruth through rows of recent graves until she stopped before a simple granite marker. The space was bare. No headstone, no plaque, just a small metal tag with a number, 1742. A temporary marker. "I don't understand," Paul said, staring at the empty plot. "Where is she?" "Mr. Hargrave?" a voice called from behind them. They turned to find a middle-aged woman approaching, clipboard in hand. her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. Her navy pantsuit and pearl earrings marked her as management rather than groundskeeping staff. "I'm Elena Vasquez, cemetery administrator," she said, extending her hand. "Ms. Calloway called to say you'd be visiting today." Paul shook her hand automatically, decades of business training overriding his confusion. "Where is my daughter's headstone, her grave?" Ms. Vasquez consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages. "Lillian Hargrave, plot 1742, interred 3 weeks ago." She glanced up, her professional smile faltering slightly at Paul's expression. "There's a note here that the family declined burial. The deceased arranged for anatomical donation." "Anatomical donation?" Paul repeated, the words foreign on his tongue. "Yes, sir. Ms. Hargrave arranged to donate her body to the Columbia University Medical Center for research and education." She hesitated, sensing his shock. "This is just a memorial plot. There's a delay with the permanent marker. The design is quite elaborate, and the stonemason requested additional time." Paul felt as if the ground beneath him had liquefied. Lily had donated her body to science? His Lily, who'd been so squeamish she couldn't watch medical shows on television, who'd needed to be sedated for routine dental work. "I have a copy of the authorization here," Ms. Vasquez continued, extracting a form from her clipboard. "Signed by Ms. Hargrave and witnessed by her attorney." Paul took the paper with numb fingers. The signature at the bottom was undeniably Lily's, the same looping script from her journal, from all those unheard cassette tapes. Beside it was a second signature, "Ruth Calloway, witness." He turned to Ruth, betrayal flooding his system like poison. "You knew about this." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I was with her when she made the arrangements. It was important to her that some part of her life would help others, would make a difference." "Excuse me," interrupted a gravelly voice. An elderly groundskeeper had approached, his weathered face creased with sun and time. He leaned on his rake, studying Ruth with curious eyes. "Aren't you the young lady who comes here on Sundays to visit Mrs. Hargrave's grave?" Ruth paled visibly, her eyes darting to Paul. "You must be mistaken," she said quickly. "I've only been here once before." The old man shook his head. No, I recognize you. Every Sunday for weeks. You bring white roses, sit and talk for hours." He nodded toward the older section of the cemetery, over by the fountain where the Hargrave family plot is. Paul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. "My wife is buried there," he said slowly. "Cremated, actually. But there's a memorial stone." The groundskeeper nodded. "That's the one. This young lady comes and talks to the stone like they're old friends. Tells Mrs. Hargrave all about her daughter." His rheumy eyes crinkled with a smile. "Says she's the granddaughter. Very devoted." Ruth seemed to shrink before Paul's eyes, her borrowed confidence dissolving into naked fear. "I can explain," she whispered. But Paul was already striding away, heading toward the older section of the cemetery, toward the place where a small marble bench sat beside a simple stone marker. The place where he had scattered Vanessa's ashes 4 years earlier, while Lily wept and he stood dry-eyed, already mentally calculating how quickly he could return to the office. He heard Ruth's footsteps behind him, her borrowed shoes, a pair of Lily's ballet flats too large for her, slapping against the pavement. But he didn't slow, didn't turn. The need to see for himself propelled him forward with single-minded intensity. The Hargrave family plot was immaculate, as befitted one of New York's oldest financial dynasties. Paul's parents, his grandparents, generations of stern-faced bankers and their socially accomplished wives, all rested beneath pristine monuments and tasteful statuary. Vanessa's memorial stone stood slightly apart, her choice specified in her will. She had never felt comfortable among the Hargraves in life, and had no desire to spend eternity crowded by their imposing presence. Her marker was simple: Vanessa Claire Hargrave, beloved wife and mother. Love is the only reality. At the base of the stone sat a small vase containing the withered remains of white roses. Paul knelt, touching the dried petals with trembling fingers. How long since he had visited this place? A year? 2? The guilt sat like a stone in his stomach. "She said you never came here." Ruth's voice came softly from behind him. She wanted someone to visit her mother, to make sure she wasn't alone. Paul didn't turn around. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Really?" Ruth was silent for so long that Paul finally looked over his shoulder. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, autumn leaves swirling at her feet. For an instant, Just a flicker. She looked so much like Vanessa that Paul's heart seized in his chest. Lily found me through her grandmother, Ruth said finally. Catherine volunteered at a women's shelter in Queens. That's where she met my sister Rachel 15 years ago. Rachel was only 13, pregnant, nowhere to go. Catherine helped her get into a program for teen mothers. Her voice caught. Rachel named her baby after Catherine, called her Ruth Catherine. Paul rose slowly to his feet, pieces falling into terrible alignment. You, Ruth nodded, a single tear tracking down her pale cheek. Me. Catherine kept in touch with Rachel over the years. She was the only stable adult in our lives. When Rachel died, Catherine tried to help me, but she was already sick herself by then. Before she died, she told Lily about me. And Lily found you, Paul said. Not a question, but a confirmation of what he already knew. At New Horizons. It wasn't an accident. She checked herself into the same facility where I was staying after my last suicide attempt. Ruth's voice was steady now, almost calm. She didn't tell me who she was at first. Just became my friend, my roommate. Then one day she showed me a picture of Catherine and I recognized her immediately. Paul's mind reeled with implications. So all of this, coming to my home, the dinner, the letters, this was some kind of plan? Some scheme you and Lily cooked up? Ruth shook her head fiercely. No, Lily really is gone. She really did. She swallowed hard. I promised her I would try to reach you afterward, to help you understand what happened, who she really was. By lying to me? By pretending to be someone you're not? Paul's voice rose, echoing among the silent monuments. I never lied about who I am, Ruth countered, a flash of defiance breaking through her fear. I just didn't tell you everything. Not right away. Lily said you wouldn't listen otherwise. Before Paul could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it, but it immediately began ringing again, the same urgent tone from his executive assistant. With a muttered curse, he answered. This better be important, Diane. The color drained from his face as he listened. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'll be right there. He ended the call and turned to Ruth, his expression unreadable. What's happened? She asked, alarm replacing defiance. That was my assistant. The police are at my office. Paul's eyes bored into hers. They have questions about the death of my daughter. Apparently someone has raised concerns about the circumstances. Ruth's eyes widened. Who would? They specifically asked about you, Paul continued, his voice deadly quiet. About Ruth Calloway, and why your fingerprints were found on the pill bottle in Lily's apartment. The Bentley sliced through Manhattan traffic like a shark through dark water, its powerful engine growling softly as Paul weaved between yellow cabs and delivery trucks with uncharacteristic recklessness. The sleek vehicle, usually a symbol of his carefully controlled success, now felt like a cage. Beside him, Ruth sat rigidly, her borrowed dress wrinkled from her tight grip on its hem. It's not what you think, she said, her words barely audible over the hum of the climate control system. Paul's eyes remained fixed on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. And what exactly do I think, Ruth? That you were somehow involved in my daughter's death? That this whole performance, the dinner, the letters, the heartfelt confessions, is some elaborate cover-up? I would never hurt Lily, Ruth whispered, her voice cracking on the name. She was the only person who ever... She trailed off, tears streaking silently down her face. They reached the towering glass edifice of Hargrave Financial Group in record time. The security guard at the underground parking entrance, a man who had greeted Paul respectfully every workday for 8 years, did a double-take at his employer's disheveled appearance and the red-eyed young woman beside him. Mr. Hargrave, the police are waiting in the conference room on 48, he said, concern evident in his voice. Ms. Winters called down, said to tell you she's there too. Paul nodded tersely and guided Ruth toward the private elevator. As the doors slid closed, sealing them in the hermetic luxury of burled walnut and brushed steel, she finally spoke again. Before we go up there, you need to see something else. She reached into the small purse she'd borrowed from Lily's closet, another relic from his daughter's life that Paul had failed to notice was missing, and withdrew a folded envelope. It looked old, the paper yellowed and soft from repeated handling. Lily wanted you to read this last, after you'd heard everything else, but I think you need it now. Paul stared at the envelope. The handwriting on the front was not Lily's distinctive script, but an elegant cursive he recognized immediately. Vanessa's handwriting. Where did you get this? His voice was a whisper, as if speaking at normal volume might cause the envelope to disintegrate. Lily gave it to me for safekeeping. It was in her safety deposit box, along with her will and the trust fund documents. Ruth held out the envelope. She said it was the most important piece of the puzzle. The elevator chimed softly, announcing their arrival at the 48th floor. Paul took the envelope and shoved it into his jacket pocket without opening it. "This isn't over," he said quietly as the doors slid open. The executive floor of Hargrave Financial Group was a study in understated power, muted grays and blues, original artwork by established masters, furniture that whispered of old money rather than shouting of new wealth. Two uniformed police officers stood near the reception desk, speaking quietly with Diane Winters, Paul's executive assistant of 15 years. Diane, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored navy suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe chignon, broke off mid-sentence when she spotted Paul. The relief on her face quickly gave way to concern as she took in his rumpled appearance and the strange young woman at his side. "Paul," she said, dispensing with her usual formality, "Detective Ramirez has been waiting. They have questions." Her eyes darted meaningfully to Ruth. Detective Ramirez was a compact woman with shrewd eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to waiting out discomfort. She extended her hand to Paul. "Mr. Hargrave, thank you for coming in. I understand this is a difficult time." Paul shook her hand automatically, years of business etiquette overriding his inner turmoil. "What exactly is this about, Detective? My assistant mentioned questions about my daughter's death. Perhaps we could speak privately," Ramirez suggested, glancing at Ruth with professional curiosity. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Ruth," Paul replied, surprising himself with the protectiveness in his voice. "She was close to my daughter." They moved to the conference room, a sleek space dominated by a massive table of polished cherry wood. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city sprawling beneath them like a vast circuit board of human ambition. Ramirez placed a thin file on the table and opened it with methodical precision. "Mr. Hargrave, I'll be direct. The medical examiner has questions about the circumstances of Lillian's death. The initial determination was suicide by prescription drug overdose, but certain inconsistencies have emerged." Paul felt the room tilt slightly. "Inconsistencies?" The toxicology report showed extremely high levels of clonazepam and sertraline in her system, higher than she could likely have taken voluntarily. Ramirez's voice was carefully neutral. "Additionally, the prescription bottle found at the scene had fingerprints belonging to Ruth Calloway but not to Lillian herself." All eyes turned to Ruth, who had gone deathly pale. I gave her the pills," Ruth whispered. "From my own prescription. She'd run out of hers, and the pharmacy was closed for the holiday weekend. She was having panic attacks, terrible ones. I was just trying to help. By giving her controlled substances prescribed to you?" Ramirez's tone sharpened. "Detective?" Paul interjected, his voice finding its familiar authoritative edge. "My daughter had been under psychiatric care. She had her own prescriptions. Ruth was helping her through a crisis." Ramirez studied him carefully. "Mr. Hargrave, with all due respect, our information suggests you and your daughter had been estranged for nearly 2 years. How much do you actually know about her mental state in the weeks before her death?" The question landed like a physical blow. Paul's carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the raw grief beneath. "Not enough," he admitted. "I knew almost nothing." In the silence that followed, Paul reached into his pocket and withdrew Vanessa's envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal, a wax impression of the Hargrave family crest, another detail that spoke of Vanessa's attention to the traditions she had married into but never fully embraced. Inside was a single sheet of Vanessa's personal stationery, the pale blue paper embossed with her initials. The letter was dated 6 months before her death. "My dearest Paul," he read aloud, his voice growing steadier with each word. "If you're reading this, then Lily has finally found the courage I never had. There is a truth I've kept from you, not out of malice, but out of fear of losing the life we built together." Paul paused, his eyes scanning ahead, widening at what he saw. He continued, "Ruth Catherine Calloway is the biological daughter of the man with whom I had a brief affair during our 2nd year of marriage. When her mother Rachel died last year, I tried to arrange for her adoption secretly. I couldn't bring myself to tell you. Not after you had so graciously forgiven my infidelity years before. Ruth is the living embodiment of my greatest mistake, but also my chance at redemption. I know now that I will not live to see this through. My cancer has spread too far, too fast. I am entrusting this secret to Lily, though it breaks my heart to place such a burden on our daughter. Paul, Ruth is not your blood, but she is a part of the debt I owe you for my betrayal. My final wish is that you might find it in your heart to see her not as the child of my sin, but as a young woman in desperate need of the kindness and stability you once showed me. I have loved you imperfectly, but completely. Always. Vanessa. The room fell silent save for the distant hum of the city below. Detective Ramirez's expression had softened almost imperceptibly. Paul looked up from the letter to find Ruth staring at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. The resemblance he had sensed to Vanessa suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. Not genetics, but something deeper. A shared wound that shaped them both. Lily found out when she was 16, Ruth said softly. Catherine, your mother-in-law, told her on her deathbed. That's why Lily started pulling away from you. She couldn't bear the weight of the secret, and when she found you at New Horizons, Paul asked, his voice hoarse. She didn't tell me who she was at first, just became my friend, my protector. Ruth's voice caught. When she finally told me the truth, that her mother was the woman who had tried to save me after my own mother died, I didn't believe her. It seemed impossible. But then she showed me pictures, letters, proof. Why didn't she just tell me? Paul whispered, the question directed more at himself than anyone in the room. She tried, Ruth replied simply. The night before she left for college, she said you cut her off, told her that her mother's past mistakes were buried with her and should stay that way. The memory sliced through Paul's consciousness. Lily, tearful and agitated, trying to talk to him about Vanessa, about secrets, about responsibilities. He had dismissed her, absorbed in the details of a major acquisition, irritated by her emotional state. Mr. Hargrave, Detective Ramirez said, her voice gentler than before. I still have questions about the circumstances of your daughter's death, but perhaps this isn't the right time or place. Paul nodded numbly, the letter still clutched in his hand. I need to go, Ruth said suddenly, rising from her chair. I shouldn't be here. Wait, Paul called, reaching for her arm as she moved toward the door. Please, don't go. She turned back, her expression a complex mixture of fear, hope, and resignation. I never wanted to hurt you. Neither did Lily. We just wanted you to see us, really see us. Paul felt something break open inside him, a dam that had held back emotions for so long they had almost fossilized. I see you now, he said, his voice raw. Too late for Lily, but I see you. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Without another word, she pulled away from his grasp and fled the room, leaving Paul standing alone with the echo of Vanessa's words imprinted on his heart. The dawn crept reluctantly into Paul's bedroom, thin gray light filtering through curtains he hadn't bothered to close the night before. He lay fully clothed on top of his immaculate duvet, staring at the ceiling, Vanessa's letter clutched to his chest like a talisman. Sleep had eluded him entirely, chased away by the relentless parade of memories that now appeared to him in a harsh new light. Lily at 7, proudly showing him a drawing he'd barely glanced at before returning to his quarterly reports. Lily at 12, attempting to tell him about being bullied at school, while he checked his emails and offered distracted platitudes. Lily at 16, her eyes hollow with a secret too heavy to bear alone, while he complained about her falling grades and what they might mean for her college applications. The soft knock at his bedroom door startled him from his reverie. Mrs. Jenkins, his housekeeper, stood in the doorway with concern etched into her weathered face. Mr. Hargrave, I'm sorry to disturb you, but it's nearly 9 and you have that board meeting at 10:30. Paul sat up slowly, his body protesting after hours of immobility. Cancel it, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Cancel everything for the week. Mrs. Jenkins blinked in surprise but recovered quickly. Of course, sir. Would you like breakfast? And she hesitated. The young lady, Miss Calloway. She left very early this morning, but she... Another pause, longer this time. She left something for you by the fireplace in the living room. Paul's heart stuttered. Did she say where she was going? No, sir, but she seemed upset. Mrs. Jenkins twisted her hands in her apron, a gesture he'd never noticed in all her years of service. If I may speak freely, sir, that young woman reminds me very much of Ms. Lily at her age, same look in the eyes. like someone carrying too much weight for such young shoulders. The observation, coming from this woman who had silently witnessed the disintegration of his family over the years, pierced Paul more deeply than any accusation could have. He made his way downstairs, his body moving on autopilot while his mind spun with 1,000 fragmented thoughts. The mansion felt different this morning, not the pristine showcase of wealth it had always been, but a mausoleum of missed opportunities and silenced voices. In the living room, the morning sun cast long shadows across the antique Persian rug, a wedding gift from Vanessa's parents who had never quite approved of the ambitious young financier their daughter had chosen. The massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel lined with tasteful photographs selected by an interior designer to create the impression of a perfect family life. On the hearth sat the blue labradorite pendant, the one Ruth had shown him, the one Vanessa had treasured. Paul had thrown it into the fire in a moment of blind rage after Ruth's revelation at the police station. Yet here it was, untouched by flames, gleaming in the morning light as if newly polished. Beside it lay a small folded note. "Even if you don't accept me, thank you for listening." Paul sank to his knees before the cold fireplace, picking up the pendant with trembling fingers. The chain was broken, melted in places, but the stone itself was intact, its blue depths catching the light in mesmerizing patterns. How had it survived? The scientific impossibility of it struck him as almost comically insignificant compared to all the other impossibilities he now faced. The phone rang, its shrill tones shattering the moment. He considered ignoring it, but some instinct made him answer. "Mr. Hargrave?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Dr. Marcus from Bellevue Hospital. We have a Ruth Calloway here. You're listed as her emergency contact." Paul's blood ran cold. What happened? "She was brought in about an hour ago. Apparent suicide attempt. Overdose." The doctor's voice was carefully neutral, but Paul could hear the unasked questions beneath the clinical report. "Is she—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "She's stable, but unconscious. We pumped her stomach and administered activated charcoal. The next 24 hours will be critical. I'll be right there." Paul was already moving toward the door, the pendant clutched in his hand. "Mr. Hargrave," the doctor added. "There was something else. She had a cassette tape with her. It has your name on it." The Bentley roared through morning traffic, weaving between delivery trucks and commuter buses with reckless urgency. Paul's mind raced faster than the vehicle, piecing together the fragments of Ruth's story and Lily's with growing horror and clarity. Bellevue Hospital's emergency entrance was a chaotic blur of ambulances, medical personnel in scrubs, and distraught families. Paul strode through it all with singular focus, his normally commanding presence amplified by desperation. "Ruth Calloway," he told the intake nurse. "I'm her emergency contact." The nurse, exhausted from an overnight shift that had clearly been challenging, consulted her computer. "Relation to patient?" Paul hesitated only a moment. "I'm her father." The word felt strange on his tongue, both a lie and, in some deeper sense he was only beginning to understand, a truth. Ruth lay pale and still in the hospital bed, an IV drip feeding clear fluids into her arm, monitors beeping with the reassuring rhythm of her heart. She looked smaller than ever, swallowed up by the institutional bedding and the oversized hospital gown. A young doctor with tired eyes approached, extending his hand. "Mr. Hargrave, I'm Dr. Marcus. We spoke on the phone." Paul shook his hand mechanically, his eyes never leaving Ruth's still form. "Will she be all right?" "We think so. She took a significant amount of anti-anxiety medication, but it was discovered relatively quickly. A maintenance worker found her in the stairwell of a parking garage." The doctor's clinical tone softened slightly. "This wasn't her first attempt. Her arms show evidence of previous self-harm." Paul thought of Lily's letter. "Ruth is like me, but different, broken in complementary ways." "The tape," he said suddenly. "You mentioned a cassette tape, Doctor." Marcus retrieved a small plastic bag from the counter. Inside was an old-fashioned cassette, identical to the ones in Lily's shoebox. The label, in Lily's handwriting, read simply, "The Last Voice of Lily." "There's an old portable player in the nurse's station," Dr. Marcus offered. "One of the older nurses uses it for relaxation tapes. I'll see if I can borrow it." Left alone with Ruth, Paul pulled a chair to her bedside and took her limp hand in his. It was cold, the nails bitten to the quick, a habit Lily had shared, though she'd tried to hide it with expensive manicures. "I'm sorry," he whispered. though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Ruth, to Lily, or to Vanessa, or perhaps to all three women whose lives had been so profoundly shaped by his failures. Dr. Marcus returned with a small cassette player, a relic from another era, its buttons worn smooth from years of use. Paul inserted the tape with reverent care and pressed play. At first, there was only silence, then a rustling sound, as if someone was settling themselves before a microphone. Then Lily's voice, clear and steady in a way he hadn't heard for years before her disappearance from his life. "Dad, if you're listening to this, then Ruth has found you and you've heard my story. Our story. There's just one more thing I need you to understand." A pause. The sound of a deep breath being taken. "If one day she comes to you, please treat her the way you wish you had treated me." The tape continued, but Paul could no longer hear it through his tears. He wept openly, something he hadn't done since he was a child. Great racking sobs that bent him double in the uncomfortable hospital chair. He didn't notice when Ruth's hand tightened slightly around his, didn't see her eyes flutter open, focusing slowly on his bowed head. "Mr. Hargrave?" Her voice was barely audible, raw from the stomach pumping and intubation. Paul looked up, his face streaked with tears, to find Ruth watching him with wary confusion. "Why are you here?" she whispered. He squeezed her hand gently, the blue pendant pressed between their palms. "Because," he said, his voice breaking on the words, "I'm trying to keep a promise to my daughter." 6 months passed like a slow exhalation. Winter blanketed New York in pristine white, then surrendered to a tentative spring. The Hargrave mansion, once an immaculate showcase of wealth and power, had gradually softened around the edges, not neglected, but less rigid somehow, as if the house itself had relaxed into a more authentic version of itself. The formal dining room, scene of that first shocking dinner, had been transformed. The imposing antique table remained, but the stiff-backed chairs had been replaced with more comfortable seating. Fresh flowers, not just white roses now, but vibrant mixed bouquets, brightened the room daily. The heavy velvet drapes that had once shrouded the windows in perpetual twilight had been drawn back, allowing natural light to spill across the polished wood. Paul stood in the doorway watching as Mrs. Jenkins set the table for two, not the elaborate formal settings of business dinners past, but simple white plates, everyday silverware, and plain linen napkins folded into rectangles rather than elaborate swans. "Is the soup ready?" he asked, adjusting his cuffs, a nervous gesture that persisted despite the casual blue button-down he wore. No tie, no jacket. He'd even traded his customary wool slacks for khakis, a concession to comfort that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Just about, sir. And the bread is warming in the oven." Mrs. Jenkins smiled. Another change. The staff smiled now, spoke freely, moved through the house without the tense vigilance that had once characterized service in the Hargrave household. The doorbell rang, a gentle chime rather than the imposing toll that had once announced visitors. Paul's heart quickened as it always did at that sound. 6 months, and still his pulse jumped when she arrived, as if some part of him feared she might not come back. He answered the door himself. Another break from tradition. Ruth stood on the doorstep, her appearance a subtle testimony to the half-year that had passed. Her once gaunt frame had filled out slightly, her face less hollow, her eyes clearer. Her hair, now cut into a neat bob, framed her face in a way that emphasized her cheekbones, so like Vanessa's, though he tried not to dwell on that resemblance too much. "Hi," she said simply, offering a small smile. "Right on time," Paul replied, stepping back to let her in. He didn't attempt to hug her. They weren't there yet, might never be, but the nod he gave her carried warmth that would have been unimaginable during their first encounters. Ruth entered, setting down the small backpack she carried everywhere, a habit from years of unstable housing, never quite believing she wouldn't need to leave suddenly. She wore a simple blue dress, new, but not expensive. One of the boundaries they had established early. He could help with her education, her therapy, her medical bills, but she wouldn't accept luxury gifts. No designer clothes, no jewelry, nothing that smacked of buying affection or easing guilt. "How was your session?" Paul asked as they moved toward the dining room. Tuesday evenings were therapy nights, individual counseling for Ruth followed by their shared dinner, which had become a ritual over the months. "Good. Challenging." She offered no more detail, and he didn't press. Another boundary, another lesson learned through trial and error. Dr. Feldman says I'm making progress. They settled at the table, the late afternoon sunlight painting golden rectangles across the polished surface. Mrs. Jenkins brought out 2 bowls of simple homemade soup, nothing like the elaborate meals the former chef had prepared, but somehow more nourishing. Paul watched as Ruth arranged her napkin, straightened her spoon with careful precision. Her movements were more controlled now, less brittle, but still holding an edge of uncertainty. 6 months of regular meals, of having enough, hadn't erased the years of scarcity before. I heard from Detective Ramirez today, he said after they had begun eating. Ruth's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. And? The case is officially closed. Lily's death has been ruled a suicide with no evidence of foul play. He kept his voice steady, though speaking of his daughter's death still felt like pressing on a bruise. Your statement and the additional evidence from her journal were sufficient. Ruth nodded slowly, absorbing the news. That's good, I think. It's closure at least. Paul took a sip of water, gathering his thoughts. There's something else. The trust fund Vanessa set up for Lily. I've spoken with the lawyers. Since Lily's gone, the funds revert to the estate, which means they come back to me. I want to establish a new trust. For you. Ruth set down her spoon, her expression immediately guarded. Paul, it's not a gift, he said quickly, having anticipated her resistance. It's what Vanessa would have wanted, what Lily would have wanted. Just enough for you to finish college without worrying about working 3 jobs. Enough for a small apartment so you don't have to live in campus housing during breaks. Nothing extravagant. She studied him for a long moment, searching for hidden motives, for strings attached, a habit born from a lifetime of disappointments and betrayals. I'll think about it, she said finally, which wasn't a no. Progress. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional clink of spoons against bowls and the distant calling of birds in the garden. Through the window they could see the white rosebush, now surrounded by other varieties, a riot of colors that somehow made the pure white bloom stand out more vividly. I brought something, Ruth said suddenly, setting down her spoon and reaching for her backpack. She pulled out a framed photograph, a snapshot of her and Lily, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, laughing into the camera with identical expressions of unguarded joy. I thought, maybe we could put it somewhere. In the house. She pushed the frame across the table, her movements hesitant. If you want to. Paul took the photograph, his throat tightening at the sight of his daughter's face. Not the carefully composed portrait that had hung in his office for years, but Lily as she really was. Messy, joyful, alive. Beside her, Ruth's face echoed the same authentic happiness. It's perfect, he said softly. We'll hang it right here. He gestured to the wall beside the table, a place of honor in the room where family gathered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dining room, Paul retrieved a small box from the sideboard. Inside was the blue labradorite pendant, its chain repaired, the stone polished to bring out its deep blue fire. I had it fixed, he said, placing it in the center of the table between them. It belonged to Vanessa, then to Lily. I think it should be yours now. Ruth stared at the pendant, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know if I should. You don't have to wear it. Not if it feels wrong. But I'd like you to have it. Paul's voice held a gentleness that still felt foreign on his tongue, but that came more naturally with each passing week. Not because you're replacing Lily. No one could ever do that. Not because you're Vanessa's responsibility, but because you're Ruth. And somehow, against all odds, you've become important to me. He reached across the table not to take her hand, they weren't there yet, but to place his own palm upward on the polished surface, an invitation rather than a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Ruth placed her fingertips lightly on his. I'm not your daughter, she said quietly. I need you to understand that. I can't be Lily for you. I know. Paul nodded, accepting the truth of her words. I don't want you to be. Lily was Lily. You're you. I'm just grateful for the chance to do better this time, to see what's right in front of me while there's still time. The pendant gleamed between them, its blue depths catching the last golden rays of sunlight. On the wall, the newly hung photograph of Lily and Ruth seemed to watch over them, a testament to what had been lost and what might, with care and patience, still be found. Ruth's fingers tightened slightly on his. Not a grasp, not yet. but the beginnings of a connection. She would have liked this, she whispered. She used to imagine it, you know. The three of us having dinner together. A real dinner with real conversation. I wish I could have given her that, Paul said, the familiar ache of regret rising in his chest. Ruth met his gaze directly, her eyes, so like Vanessa's, holding his without flinching. She didn't want you to love her, you know. Not at the end. She just wanted you to see her. To really see her. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, in the warm glow of the dining room, two broken people sat across from each other. Not healed, not whole, but present. Really present, for perhaps the first time. Sometimes the greatest distance isn't measured in miles, but in the space between two people sitting at the same table. Paul Hargrave had everything money could buy, but he lost what truly mattered, the chance to know his daughter while she was still alive. How many of us build walls so high that we can't see those reaching for us from the other side? How many moments slip away while we're focused on what we think matters, only to realize too late what truly does? Would you have the courage to read the letter? To listen to the tape? To look into the eyes of someone who carries the weight of your mistakes and still offer them a seat at your table? The truth is, we all have people in our lives we look at but don't truly see. People whose stories we think we know but have never bothered to hear. Paul's journey reminds us that redemption doesn't always come when or how we expect it. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a stranger with familiar eyes, offering us one last chance to get it right. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need this message today. Follow our channel for more stories that remind us of the profound connections that make us human, even when they're broken. And remember, it's never too late to truly see someone, until suddenly, it is. What conversation have you been putting off? What relationship needs your full presence? Don't wait for the empty chair to remind you of what matters most.